Hi everyone, welcome back. Today I was going to go over all the questions that people have asked in the comments of the YouTube videos. These videos are brought to you by our Patreon subscribers. Our top contributors are trueaquaponics.com, greenlifeplanet.net, glassbottleoutlet.com, and growpockets.com. Thanks for your support. I have about 2 pages worth of comments to get through, so hopefully you'll stay tuned through this whole thing, and it will answer a whole bunch of the questions that are normally asked. I broke these up into 3 different segments, one about building the greenhouse itself, a short segment about energy consumption, and the last, the aquaponics setup itself. So here we go with building. Why do you need to get so many permits? This goes back to me making a comment in one of the real early videos about this, about needing to get permits. So here in Connecticut, you definitely have to follow rules and pay for a lot of different permits. So for this setup, I had to get a wetlands permit because we're close to a small wetlands, and you have to make sure you aren't disturbing the habitat in that area. We also had to get a building permit for the electrical install. And thankfully that's really about it. Most areas you'd also have to get a zoning permit, but this greenhouse is not classified as a permanent structure, so we don't have to deal with local zoning. But yes, Connecticut is pretty strict with making sure you get all the permits. Oh, I also had to do the call before you dig, which doesn't cost anything, so that one's not a big deal. But yeah, it's very heavily regulated on what you can and can't build on your property here. That's just what we have to suffer through here in Connecticut. What is the size of the greenhouse? Well, originally I thought this was a 26 by 144 foot greenhouse, and as I was putting it up, once I got to the end, I had an extra set of bows. So it is a 26 by 148, which is the same as having 48 square feet of area. When you installed the greenhouse posts, you didn't insulate around them. Why didn't you install chicken wire underground to keep the pests out? Mostly this is a cost-related issue. When I originally dug the trench for the posts in here, I did consider putting insulation in around the perimeter, but it was going to cost $1,500 or so just for the insulation. Plus, then having to backfill it, I'd have to be very careful with backfilling on either side of the insulation. So it was just a cost and time. Same thing with putting the chicken wire. I did consider putting some in just to help keep some of the woodchucks and other burrowing varmints out of the greenhouse. But usually the woodchucks like to dig around here in the sides of hills, so they wouldn't really come up next to the greenhouse and dig down and around. So I'm not overly concerned about that. As you know, in past videos I have set traps for woodchucks and other creatures, so I'm not adverse to disposing of creatures like that. I know some people try not to bother them, but once they get into the greenhouses, I will set traps for them. If they're outside of the greenhouse, I just leave them alone. This one's not a question, it's more of a statement, but I figured I'd share with it anyways. You're part of the world's problem, cutting down trees and stripping land to grow crops. Well, none of us are in a winning situation when it comes to growing or doing anything. You have to even look at the computer or the cell phone that you're using, the amount of land that has to be strip mined for the gold and other elements that are used in your everyday living. It's just everybody's part of the problem. I attempt to do my best at minimizing the impact that we have here. This greenhouse is built in an existing field. We did have to cut down a few trees and level out the ground a little bit. But overall, the environmental impact of this greenhouse is negligible. Partly also with growing crops in here, lettuce is not a common product here in Connecticut. Most lettuce would be shipped in from California, so you're bringing it across the country. So we are trying to minimize the amount of transportation by growing lettuce here in Connecticut, so it can be sold locally. So it's just the way it is, you know, how we try to make a living here and reduce that impact. This is related to one of the earlier videos also when we were clearing part of the land. Why do you burn your brush? Why don't you compost it? You have to remember that this is a business that we're trying to run, so if we spend the time trying to gather it up and compost it, brush does take a very long time to compost. It's not like it's grass clippings or anything. So by taking it, having to move it, and then having it stored someplace to compost, and it takes a lot of space up, it's just not an economical solution when I can just burn it. If you burn your brush really fast and hot, you don't get a whole lot of really harmful pollutants coming out of it. You know, it still is generating some carbon dioxide, carbon monoxide, and whatnot. But for the most part, if you have a nice dry brush pile and you burn it cleanly, it's not too bad. Do you let volunteers help you with the build? Every so often you may catch a glimpse of somebody in one of my videos helping me out. I have a couple of friends that have helped me out in the past with a couple of things. But for the most part, this whole project is done by myself or subcontracted out, like the excavation work was contracted out by somebody else that has the equipment. It is actually difficult to find a jack of all trades that's capable of doing just about anything, whether it's you know, pulling plastic, doing groundwork, doing plumbing work, doing electrical work, welding, anything like that. A lot of times these are specialty trades that if somebody comes to help, they may not have a firm understanding of all the other aspects of this. It's one of the unique things with aquaponics is having to deal with so many different things. So partly it's me wanting to just get through the project and not having to take the time to show or train somebody what to do with it. So unfortunately I don't have a lot of volunteers, just every once in a while I will. Plus with my schedule it's very sporadic, so I don't always have the time to be able to spend 6 or 8 hours in a day with somebody. If they did come out to help for an entire day, it's difficult for me to spend that much time with them. Where did you buy your greenhouse and what brand is it? This greenhouse I bought on Craigslist, so I don't know the brand and where it originally came from. I bought it from a defunct nursery that was selling their greenhouses, so it was actually very cheap to buy this. They dismantled it and delivered it for me. So it's quite old. I think they said it was about 30 years old, so this was originally built in the 80s. So for the age of it, it's actually in a very good condition. Everything else, the plastic and everything, that's all new, but the greenhouse frame itself is used, so I don't know where it came from. Related to that is what is the covering? I think I mentioned it in one of the earlier videos. This is solar wrap. It looks like bubble wrap. It's a 2-ply polyethylene plastic covering. I think the R value on it's like 1.7, 1.8, and lets 85-87% light transmission. It has really nice diffusion in it, so there's not a lot of shadowing in here, and it is UV treated, so we don't get a lot of UV light in here, and it also doesn't degrade in the UV like some of the standard poly covering does. Plus with it coming in the 4-foot rolls, if there is one section that gets damaged or torn, which doesn't seem to be very likely, I can just pull that one section out and then pull a new section in without having to recover the entire greenhouse. It is more money than putting up poly, but the time savings in the long run of not having to keep putting plastic up every 3 or 4 years will basically pay for itself with labor savings. Related to that, somebody asked why I don't unroll the wrap in another direction. I had made this jig up to help unroll the rolls, and it actually looked really strange because it came up and over the rolls, down under, and then up into it. Unlike toilet paper where it doesn't matter which way you unroll it, this does make a difference because only one side of the plastic has UV protection. So if you put it on backwards, it will actually degrade upside down essentially. And so the outer layer would degrade and then your inner layer would be fine. So the way that it's installed is correct where the UV is on the outside layer. Isn't your covering going to tear with the flopping in the wind? The manufacturer states that it won't. It's in these tracks and it won't pull out. We've had some pretty strong winds already, and the greenhouse does, you can hear it flopping. You may even hear it flopping a little bit today because it's quite windy. But basically it just sort of blows in and out and does its thing, and it won't tear off of its tracks. So hopefully it will continue with that. Typically they try to pull greenhouse plastic as tight as possible to keep it from flopping in and out, but this one, it seems to be okay without that. You have a lot of tools. A normal person wouldn't be able to build this. Well, that may be the case. I'm getting old enough where throughout my career I've collected a lot of tools. Over the past 30 or 40 years, I've always collected various tools and kept track of that. So it's part of the trade that you're in, is being able to do a lot of this work yourself. So if you're not willing to make a little bit of investment in various tools, this may not be a job that you'd be interested in doing. Sometimes you need a specialty tool, so if you can find a friend that has that, that's great. Or if you're only going to use it once in a while, even though they're cheap junk tools most of the time, Harbor Freight's a great place to get some of these one-off tools. Usually if I want it for a long period of time, I'll usually buy something that I know is going to last me a long time. You'll see a lot of my electric tools are usually DeWalt or some of the other better brands, and not the low-end brands. So it's really on how you want to make your investment. If you're going to hire somebody to do some of the work, that's also fine, but typically I'll buy the tool so I can do the work myself, and then down the road I'll be able to perform maintenance on that particular thing. Alright, moving on to energy. Are you going to install solar panels like you did on the dome? I don't have any plans on doing solar with this setup. The building is too large, and with the dome my goal on that was to keep that building off grid, which really was a mistake for that purpose. Having to deal with the batteries on that setup is just a horrible mess. It's very time consuming to have to fill them, check them, and then if you have a lot of cloudy days, once the batteries are drained, you don't have any power. So I have wired that greenhouse to be on grid, and I sort of switch back and forth between running that off of solar and running it off the grid power. If you did want to do solar, especially if you have grid power close, don't try to run it off grid. Just put the thing on an inverter and feed back or sell your power back onto the grid. So during the summer when you have excess power, you can sell that power back onto the grid, and then during the winter when you have low light, you just start buying the power back, and that's usually the most economical solution. But for this greenhouse I don't have plans on running it off of solar. Why didn't you install geothermal tubes? Well, again, I did that in the dome greenhouse, and they actually work heating wise fairly well. Here in Connecticut, the ground temperature is about 51 or 52 degrees, so it's not very warm, and you have to dig down about 8 feet to be able to get to that consistent temperature. The dome does blow out air about that temperature, but you also have to remember that a greenhouse is very energy inefficient. So if you're blowing air out at 52 degrees, you're blowing it into a greenhouse in the winter time where it may be 0, -10 out, and that 52 degree air makes almost no difference when your R value is less than 2. Plus there's some airflow coming through here. So you really have to pump a lot of air and have a really large geothermal system in place. Also, with that greenhouse, I've essentially abandoned using the geothermal, mainly because you're taking that warm, humid air and you're blowing it underground, and the humidity condenses in the piping. It accumulates in there. Even though they are perforated and can drain out, you still get water accumulating in there, and you start getting mildew or mold growing in there, and then you're blowing that back out in the greenhouse. So actually, when I've used it in the past, I've seen just by blowing air in there, all of a sudden you get mold within a couple of days growing on the plants. So that's not really good. So now you're at a stage where you need less humid air, so you're drawing it in from the outside instead, especially during the winter. Now you're taking really cold air and trying to warm it up in the ground and blowing that into the greenhouse. So it may solve your mold issue, but now you have a much larger heat variance of getting that cold outside air warmed up and enough to blow into the greenhouse. And here we also have a lot of ledge or rock in the ground, so just digging out trenches and whatnot can get really expensive. If I recall properly, to do this greenhouse just for the excavation work is going to be $8,000 or $9,000, plus then all the tubing, bringing in sand and gravel for it and whatnot. So we were probably looking at a $15,000 project just to put geothermal in. And again, it still wouldn't be enough to heat the greenhouse. So yeah, it's great in theory. Some areas are able to do it. There are places in northern climates that can do it. But again, from a commercial standpoint, if I need to heat this, I'm going to put propane heaters in and just use fossil fuels for it. It's unfortunate, but it's sort of a necessity in this area. You should heat with compost. Very similar to the geothermal. It's just you can't generate enough heat out of compost. You heat a place like this, again, you have a huge amount of heat loss. There was a study done, I believe, at the University of Vermont where they did that, and their compost pile was essentially the same size as their greenhouse. Plus the labor involved with gathering that much compost. We just don't generate enough compost, so I'd have to now truck it in or pay to have it trucked in, and then spend the time turning it to help keep it properly heated. And then also installing tubing to circulate water or air through it. And it's just so labor intensive, it isn't worth the aggravation to do it. You also invite pests, rats and whatnot during the winter because they're coming into the compost for the heat and the food that's in there. So it's really best just to dispose of the compost offsite or have it local and have a small compost pile and just compost what's getting generated out of the greenhouse and not bring in any additional materials. Are you going to use a rocket mass heater like you did in the dome? Again, it all comes down to economics. The rocket mass heater works really well in the greenhouse. Again, it's labor intensive, so a structure this size, I would need a really large one or a whole bunch of smaller ones, and then just having the cut wood or feed pellets into it on a constant basis usually isn't worth it. So if I do decide to heat this, like I was saying earlier, it would be a propane heater in here, or I could invest in an outdoor wood boiler where I can put large uncut or unsplit logs into it and just start feeding it with large amounts of wood that way. And are you going to make this an all-season greenhouse? Again, it's all economics. If it's worth the cost to heat the greenhouse over the winter. Also, I'd have to install lighting in here. We just don't get enough sunlight during the winter to grow crops consistently. We can go for a week or two of not having much sunlight with a lot of overcasts. So now you have to augment that with artificial lights. And heating it can get quite expensive. So you sort of have to make a decision on if you want to heat and light this. You can produce all winter long. The benefit of that is you can keep your existing customers, go someplace else, but the chances are you may break even or even lose money over the winter in this area again. Don't forget, a lot of the scenarios that I have here, a lot of people will probably disagree with it. It really does come down to economics. I mean, you can travel 100 miles, 200 miles south of here where the climate could be a hair different. And you can run numbers through it and they can be totally different than what they are here. So it really depends on the climate of your area. All right, we're probably halfway there. We're going to move on to the aquaponics setup. Thanks for sticking in with this so far. Where did you buy your tanks? These tanks here came from, I can't remember their name now. These tanks came from Ace Rotomolding. They sell through a distributor network. So you would want to go to their website and look up who the local distributor is. the place that we worked with here in New England was very good and accommodating, and these were special order tanks because they typically don't do them in blue. You have a choice of, I believe, blue, dark green, or the natural white color. The blue is enough to shade the tanks a little bit from algae growing. I still get a little bit of algae growth in here, but it's not too bad. Why not put the tanks underground to save energy? Really, the whole system is designed to work above ground. I did not want to have to dig large holes to bury the tanks. I did that in the other greenhouse, and really I shouldn't have. It was based off of some older design ideas that I had, and as I've learned along the way, it's best just to stay out of the ground. Plus, also with burying these plastic tanks, you essentially need some type of strong wall around that, because the plastic tanks will expand and contract a little bit, and by doing that, it will also the dirt will slowly contract in around those tanks also, and when the tanks go to re-expand again, they can't, and so the dirt will eventually push in and collapse those tanks. So you need some type of cage, and you may recall in the dome greenhouse I actually built a brick wall around each of those tanks. And at that point, you now have an air gap. The tanks are a little bit insulated just because they're made out of plastic, so you don't get a lot of thermal transfer coming in and out of the tanks. And so it's really just not worth the aggravation to bury them. It's also difficult to do maintenance on them if you had to get to them or replace them. Just keep them up above ground is perfectly fine. Where did your bed liners come from? The bed liners came from the same place where I got the solar wrap covering. They came from, I'm drawing a blank again. See, this is why you should write everything down. They came from Global Plastic Sheeting. They are very good about shipping everything all together, so it helps save on the shipping cost. Are you going to install lighting? I touched on that a little bit earlier about growing over the winter. I'm undecided, currently leaning towards no. Still, the cost of LED lighting or any other type of lighting can be quite expensive and very energy intensive, even with LED lights. I wanted to get through one winter first. I got a lot of statistics on what the temperatures were in here and how much lighting it was. So I'll go through and reevaluate if we're going to do lighting. A lot of it will come down to once we get the setup up and running, if I have customers that will want produce throughout the winter or not. This is probably the most asked question from everything, is how much did everything cost? And can you do a cost breakdown for each section of your build? No, I'm not going to do a cost breakdown for each section. The main reason being is every location is going to be different. Even the cost of your structures, the amount of site work that needs to be done, what you're building inside of your greenhouse. So what my business model may be will probably not match what your business model is going to be. So if you were planning on building a structure like this, you really need to put together a business plan, make up a spreadsheet. Spreadsheets, you can use Google Docs or something like that, just to do the calculations, and go through and figure it out yourself. I don't want to sound mean about it, but you really should. I've had people contact me, say, "Oh, send me your spreadsheet and I'll just change around some of the numbers." It's still not the same as doing the exercise yourself. You want to make sure that you understand what your business model is going to be for that. With that being said, we originally budgeted for $90,000, I believe, for this build. Currently, we're at $52,583. I'm sort of anal about keeping track of my costs because I want to know how much it's going to cost. So that's the bulk of the build, and that included the site work, and which was a large amount of it. So that includes the site work, the frame, the plastic, the grow beds, insulation tanks, and everything. I still have to install a well, so that's going to be another $10,000. We're currently replenishing this off of our house water, so I'm dragging garden hoses down 500 feet to here from our house. Not the most ideal situation, and our well doesn't have a lot of water, so part of the plan is to install a well. They aren't cheap to do around here. Our house well is 700 feet. and it gets less than a gallon a minute out of it. So hopefully when we do a well here, we'll get a little bit more water flow out of it, but we'll see. Related to finances, where did the money come from to build this? So as I mention in just about every video, and I get complaints about it every once in a while about begging for money, we do have a Patreon page where we do generate some funds for the greenhouse. I get ad revenue from YouTube, but that really doesn't pay for the majority of this. Most of the funding for this comes from Bigelow Brook Farm itself through the sale of our grow grips, which are sold through our distribution network like True Aquaponics, the Aquaponics Source, and many others, Amazon, or you can buy them direct from us from our website. So if you are buying some grow grips for using your plants, you are helping to support our farm and the expansion process. Can you send me your designs for your setup? The designs that I've shown on the website, or rather on the YouTube videos, is basically all I'm going to publish about the setup. Like I was saying earlier, everybody's going to have a different setup depending on what your climate is, what your growing needs are going to be, the type of fish that you're going to do. And so what my design would not necessarily match anything that anybody else is going to have. So I'm not a fan of just handing out my designs. I do have some more details published on our Patreon, so you have to pay for those. You know, a couple bucks per video, you get some more of the details about this setup. But for the most part, if you really aren't sure of how to do a design, I'd recommend taking one of the classes like from Aquaponics Source, or Ryan Chatterson Farms, or maybe Murray if you're in Australia, something like that. But just handing out the designs to somebody that doesn't fully understand the nuances of them, it's just not in good conscience for me to release that kind of information. Why don't you use an airlift pump instead of a standard one? They are more efficient. They're not more efficient, not even close. Once you have to lift anything, any true distance, you will find that a centrifugal pump is going to be far more efficient, especially these little DC ones. I can pump with these 12 or 1300 gallons an hour up with 4 feet ahead without any problem. And if I tried to do that with an air pump, I just need a huge pump. And they really do start becoming inefficient. I know a lot of people don't like to hear that, but that's the facts. You just can't fight the physics behind them. I do use an air pump in my mineralization tank behind me, basically because they work well for circulating the solids, because there's no impeller for anything to get caught in. And I'm not lifting it more than an inch or two above the regular water height. So you get a lot of circulation flow through there. The airlift pumps are typically used in like the outdoor natural swimming pools because you're not lifting the water very high. Again, a couple of inches, and they can suck up frogs and fish and whatnot without any problem in them. But for the most part, a standard pump is really going to be your best bet. Skipping back, can you send me the calculations for your setup? The same thing. I mean, there are some general calculations. If you want to look up calculations on sizing, like your plants to fish ratio, there's the FAO manual, which is online, and if you go on the forums, you'll see that people are beating it over other people's heads to reference that. That's probably one of the better solutions, or take a class. Again, the calculations change based off of your fish that you're growing, your water temperatures, the type of plants. You know, different plants uptake different nutrients at different speeds. Different fish at different temperatures eat food at different rates. So again, you should just work through those calculations. And over to the fish tank, why do you have a solid lifting output, also known as slow output, and an overflow? The slow outputs work really well for getting the solids up off the bottom of the tank, and once you get up into the upper part of the tank, there's really not a whole lot floating around in there, since most of the fish feed will eventually settle down and all the fish poo settles down to the bottom, so you don't get a lot floating around the top. I believe this is a Cornell style design where obviously with their name they must have developed that type of technology where you can skim the water off the top of the tank and it's essentially clean, and then you can have the solid lifting output coming off the bottom at a far slower rate, and that allows you to have a smaller filtration system installed, and you have more concentrated solids going through that system instead of just having all the water going through it, and then you need a really large settling tank and whatnot. So it's a really good solution for having a dual outlet fish tank. Where did you get the PVC gate valves? The gate valves and a lot of my plumbing fittings, including the bulkhead fittings, came from flexpvc.com. They have tons of stuff. Their website's horrible, but their selection is great, and they ship it really quick, and they have fair pricing. One note with the gate valves: when you have a gate valve, you probably should not have that just open to the atmosphere if you're going to use it like as a standard drain on a tank. The gate valves are very good for flow control, but they do tend to leak a little bit, especially once they start getting a little bit older. So if you are going to have a valve just exposed to the atmosphere for a drain, install a ball valve. They're harder to turn than a gate valve, but they seal off much better. Your design is too complicated. I get that quite a bit. Some people think you can just put a fish tank in with a deep water culture bed and be done with it, but you do need some type of filtration installed. This setup, it really is simple. It goes from a fish tank to the radial flow settler that settles out. I don't have to have the mineralization tank. That's probably the most complicated part of the setup. You could just have a waste valve and drain out your solids out of your settler every day or a couple times a day. And then you can go into your bioreactor or an MBBR, and then into the deep water culture bed. So it's just a couple of stages, and really if you don't have those, you're just asking for trouble if you have a fish tank draining into your deep water culture beds. Don't use bell siphons. They always fail. They always fail if you don't know how to use them properly or don't do the wrong design. I have bell siphons in the dome. They've been in there for 6 or 7 years now, and they're working perfectly fine. I did do a redesign on them. Even if the bell siphon does start to fail, it's usually because you have roots getting into your drain area and it starts getting up into the bell siphon. So just you just have a little bit of maintenance. So you pull them out, pull out the roots, and put the bell siphons back in. And maybe once a month I just quickly check that. So it's not a big deal, but there are other ways that you can do flood and drain with your media beds. So I'm not going to beat bell siphons over your head, but they work perfectly fine for our setup. You should paint your tanks to prevent algae. That could be the case, but with this style of tank, they're all made out of polyethylene. Polyethylene is notorious for not letting things stick to it. So if you did paint these, most likely the paint's going to peel off. And so that's why I spent a little extra money and just had them painted this way. And most likely up above, over them, I'll put some type of a canopy just to block the direct sunlight from hitting the top of the tanks. But you have a lot of custom plastic parts that no one else has access to. And is the PLA safe to use? Well, to hit the PLA question, PLA is what most people use in their 3D printers. It's a sugar-based plastic, and doing some quick research on it, if it does start to break down, they technically say that it is safe for human consumption if you're ingesting parts of this, unlike some of the other types of plastics out there. So yeah, all the parts that I have in here that are custom made are made out of PLA. And for the part on the custom plastic parts, that is the case on many things. I use a lot of these custom parts just because they're easy for me to produce. My profession is dealing with a lot of CAD work and design, so it's easy for me to just design something up really quickly and print it out. Many of the things that I make could be machined out of plastic or just made out of other types of fittings. But I like to tinker a little bit, try to fine-tune some of these things, make them run more efficiently. So I don't know if it's unfair disadvantage, but that's sort of part of the deal with being in the business world is trying to have a little bit one up on the competition, just to help either save money or make a product that's a little bit different than somebody else. So I seem to have a lot of statements in here. This is a plastic nightmare and no way to grow organically. Well, that may be a nice opinion. I don't think I've ever stated that I grow organically in here. I try to grow as organic as possible and minimize a lot of the impact. You know, some people are growing naturally just in regular soil and have fields. When you get into some large organic growers, you'll see that they'll lay down huge amounts of sheet plastic as weed barriers and whatnot. And that's probably more plastic every season that they lay down than what this entire greenhouse and tanks are made out of. And that's a disposable plastic. They just wrap it up and toss it in a landfill. So it's all in the perspective of how you look at it. Everything that's plastic in here, it will be used over and over again, probably throughout my entire career with growing this greenhouse. So using plastics isn't all that bad. Everything that I use in here is as safe as I possibly can get it. The plastic coating is polyethylene, the tanks are polyethylene, the bed liners are polyethylene. Yes, the plumbing is PVC. And depending on whose unofficial blog you're reading, some people say it's going to kill you. Some people say it's perfectly fine. I edge on the side of that PVC. For the most part is fine, unless you start burning it or something really nasty. So for the most part, using plastics is just a part of life when it comes to farming and this type of farming. How do you access the 8-foot bed behind the 4-foot one? This setup is designed where there are two beds right next to each other, so yes, it is difficult to access a raft in the middle of one of these setups. Really, it's designed to be accessed from either end of the setup, so you would plant the new plants on one side and keep pushing it down like an assembly line, and then harvest on the other side. Just like some of the really large hydroponic commercial growers, you'll see that these beds can be 100 feet wide and 100 feet long or even bigger. And if there was a problem with pests or whatever, they essentially will shove some of the rafts out of the way and put on some boots and wade through it. But for the most part, with these quick crops that are done in 8, 10, 12 weeks, if you did have a pest problem, by the time the plants make it to the other end, you just dispose of those plants, kill off your pests, and away you go, or try to treat for them by spraying, and the sprays will reach into the middle. So for the most part, there's really no need to access the middle of the beds. Why did you install media beds instead of moving bed bioreactor? Those are just acronym is MBBR on that. Mainly for energy consumption. I've been over the years very happy with using the expanded shale in these beds, and they take far less energy to operate. These beds work off of gravity, so the water coming out of the fish tank works its way into the radial flow filter, which then flows into the media beds, which then flows into the deep water culture beds, and then gets pumped back up to the fish tank. By having MBBR in there, yes, those can work by gravity with the water, but they also need a lot of air in them to help circulate the media that's in there. So essentially for this setup, it's running off of, currently running off of a 60-watt pump. Just the air pump for MBBR for this size setup could easily be 100 or 150 watts. So I can essentially double the electric usage or triple the electric usage just for dealing with that part of it. Plus with these beds, I can still grow plants in them, so I would grow my longer term plants. A lot of the herbs, rosemary, oregano, sage, thyme, they can grow in these beds. I wanted to grow them anyways, so they can just keep growing in here even over the winter. So I do find value in using media beds over something like the MBBR, which it is perfectly suitable for a lot of scenarios. But again, it's a business decision that I made to help keep some of the costs down on the electric usage. What software do you use for your designs? you'll probably see I've done a lot of 3D CAD work with a lot of designs posted on my YouTube videos. And I use Autodesk Inventor for everything. You could use Fusion 360 or Onshape. SolidWorks, very expensive but very good. A lot of people use Google SketchUp. Throughout my career, I've used Autodesk products, so I've always been very familiar with using Autodesk Inventor. So that's what I settled on using, and it does a really nice job making nice pictures for you guys to see. This one is a direct quote from one of the comments. Most of the other questions that I've asked have been combinations and paraphrased, but this one's so great I quoted it directly. Do you ever worry about the well-being of your fish? That's a pretty bad prison you're building for them. They must go insane. I get a lot of comments like this. A lot of them I actually have to delete because people start getting belligerent when they make their statements. The fish health is excellent. I've had koi in these setups for years and haven't had really any health issues with them. I keep the water moving, I keep it clean, and their environment is excellent. I've had people say that I need to put toys in there or put gravel or other things for them to play with. The fish really don't care about that. They're essentially glad to be alive. Fish in their natural habitat are in typically a very extreme habitat where they're always either prey or predator, so they're always constantly looking out for themselves or looking for food. So the koi are quite docile, not needing a whole lot of maintenance, and actually have a pretty good life. These tanks are oversized for what I need. You'll see a lot of setups that they'll put tanks up on stands because you don't need that much water, but instead I put tall tanks in. They go all the way down to the ground, mainly so that they can have a much lower stocking density in these tanks, which also helps improve their life quality. So for all the people worried about the health of the fish, really no need to do that. The fish are well cared for. And related to that, why do you grow koi instead of something like tilapia or maybe catfish? The koi, as I was just mentioning, they're relatively easy to raise. Again, being in Connecticut and everything being heavily regulated, even growing something like catfish, there's special licensing that you have to deal with. So it's just not something I want to get involved with. Myself, I'm not a big fish eater, so I really don't have much of a need to grow food fish. And something like tilapia, they just would not survive in this type of environment. I keep the water way below what their normal temperatures would be. And the cost to heat the water to get it up, 65 or 70 degrees is just, it would be astronomical to heat the water up to that. During the winter here, our water temperature was floating around 33 or 34 degrees. I had ice on top of the tank for a while, and the koi can tolerate that. So it's an economics. Plus some of these koi are actually quite valuable. I can easily sell some of these koi for $100, $150 in cash if somebody comes up and asks me for it, and I have no problem handing one off to them as a ornamental fish for their pond. Why is it taking so long to finish the project? I think the first video I released on this might have been 3 years ago, so yes, it has taken a long time. It basically boils down to two things. Time. I do have a full-time job doing other things, design work. I also do some consulting design work on the side, along with this. So yeah, it's a lot of it's time, and it's also financially driven. I only buy things for this as I can afford to do so. I'm not going to put the company into debt, especially long-term debt. To do this build out. There's just no need to. Eventually, once everything is up and running, it'll start generating some income. But yes, I could have taken out a loan to do that. Yes, I could have hired out a lot of labor, but then all of a sudden your project costs could double or triple without any problems. And lastly, last question is, do you do tours? Yes, we do have tours once in a while. I have been cutting back on doing the personal tours. In the past, I just have somebody call and say, I'd like to come check out your place. And I actually enjoy doing that. However, a quick tour that you think might last a half an hour, I have the tend to start gabbing about aquaponics pretty good, and all of a sudden it can become a 2 or 3 hour chat session with somebody. So I've sort of narrowed those down to more of a scheduled tour, and if you're interested in that, you can check that out on our website on when we're going to be doing open houses or tours, or if you have a school group or something like that, I definitely accommodate those on a more less strict schedule. So feel free to contact me if you're interested in doing a tour. So that's about it for now. The sun has been coming out and the temperature is starting to skyrocket in here. I first started out at around 65 degrees. It was nice and comfortable, and now it feels like it's about in the high 70s. So it doesn't take much to heat up this greenhouse once the sun starts to come out. I'd like to thank you for hanging out to watch this. I especially would like to thank the Patreon contributors and the ads that do show up on YouTube. If you can check out some of those supporters, when you click on those, they do help support the channel and help generate a little bit of income for us. So once again, thanks for watching.